The announcement trailer for Sid Meier's Civilization VI made me very excited when it showed up on the internet in 2016. Not just because there was a new iteration of my favorite PC game franchise coming soon, and right around my birthday, no less, but also because the message of the trailer made me excited for the possibility that Civilization VI would take a much more humanist and globalist approach to its gameplay and victory conditions compared to past iterations in the franchise. The Civilization games have always had a very optimistic tone, treating human development as being constantly progressing forward. Growing your civilization and building more things is almost always better. For the most part, Civilization treats human history as a constant forward march towards a better, more prosperous tomorrow, which, as recent events have been showing us almost every day, isn't necessarily the case. This is despite the games including mechanics for Dark Ages, climate change, nuclear fallout, and occasionally pandemics and plagues, and so forth. Regardless of these mechanics, the civilizations of the game never regress, unless it's by the sword or gun of a conquering civilization, in which case, that other civilization is glorified. Climate change or nuclear winter can run rampant and render the surface of the Earth borderline uninhabitable for modern human life, but a civilization can still accumulate enough science, or tourism, or faith, or diplomatic votes, or whatever, to win one of the various victories, or they could be the sole surviving civilization, presiding over a barren wasteland. But a win's a win. Despite vague gestures towards diplomatic cooperation and solving global crises, Civilization is, at its core, a game of competitive, cutthroat, zero-sum nationalism. This design ethos is probably the result of Civilization's inspirations coming from competitive board games like Avalon Hill's Civilization and Risk. Our country is better than your country, and the whole game is an exercise in proving that. Further, our civilization's success must come at the expense of every other civilization's failure, even if those civilizations are your friends or allies. One civ wins, all others lose. Every decision made is done to move your civilization closer to one of those victory conditions, and every diplomatic agreement, trade deal, or alliance that you strike is only a temporary means to an end. So, what exactly did Civilization VI's trailer do to potentially change my expectations for that game? Well, first of all, it's kind of important to know how previous trailers and intro cinematics for Civilization games have introduced their respective games. Usually they emphasize a single nation or leader doing great things, winning wars, building wonders, developing advanced technologies, and so forth. And they usually ask the audience, how will you run your civilization, or will your civilization stand the test of time? The trailer for Civilization VI, however, takes a subtly different approach. Let's take a look at it, and hopefully I don't get a copyright strike. You know, fair use for critical and analytical purposes and all that.
We are the explorers, the inventors, the architects of change, the builders of a better tomorrow. We strive, we dream, we inspire, always towards something greater. All the odds we defy, the risks we take, the challenges we endure, only make us stronger. There's no end to our imagination. And no limit to civilization.
Notice the language that is used here. The Civilization VI trailer uses plural language, such as we, us, and our. We are the builders of a better tomorrow. The challenges we endure only make us stronger. And most importantly, there is no end to our imagination and no limit to civilization. And so forth. The trailer for Civilization VI isn't a celebration of one civilization or leader rising above all others and being crowned the greatest civilization of all time. It's about the collective achievement of all of humanity. Not a civilization, but all of human civilization. It's a beautifully humanistic expression that emphasizes plurality and doesn't elevate any one culture or race or nation above any other. It celebrates the collective technological advancements, engineering, art, and struggles of all of humanity without implying that any one nation or group has the best stuff. It emphasizes that we can overcome challenges by working together and come out the other side stronger for it. It implies that when we cooperate to build something or solve a problem, the result will be better than what any individual entity could have accomplished alone. Now, granted, this is a matter of interpretation. The use of the words we, us, and our could just as easily be interpreted as referring to the collective population of just a single civilization or nation. You know, we the people in order to form a more perfect union and all that. But that's not how I heard it in my head. Even if you choose to still see this language as nationalistic, the ambiguity present in this language is still a subtle shift from the more explicitly nationalistic tone of the previous game's trailers and intros. When I saw this trailer for the first time, I thought that perhaps this game, the sixth in the series, would differentiate itself from the previous games in the franchise by taking this humanist message more to heart. I thought that the sense of plurality and cooperation present in the trailer would be representative of what Firaxis was going for with the actual game itself, that it would be a major emphasis of the gameplay's design, or maybe even an artistic theme present throughout the game. Unfortunately, the actual game does not quite live up to the ideals that I saw in the trailer. Teaser trailer aside, Civilization VI, as a game, does not veer too far from the formula established by its predecessors. In many ways, the vanilla release of Civilization VI was just an iteration of the ideas and concepts of Civilization V, but with much higher production quality and a more finished, polished feel compared to what Civilization V had at its release. Civilization VI is still a strictly competitive, nationalistic game based around the same zero-sum victory model in which a single victorious leader wins out at the expense of all other civilizations and leaders. One civilization wins, and all others lose. This is true no matter how closely allied or related the winner might be from some of those losers, and no matter how intertwined their economies or research or culture or religions might be. If you aren't the winner, then everything you've ever done throughout the game is essentially rendered moot. Another civilization launching a colony ship to Mars isn't seen as a monumental scientific and technological achievement that is celebrated by the entire world. Instead, Civilization VI acts as if that one nation launching a Martian colony ship causes all other nations to crumble to ruins and dust. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and put the first man in orbit, the United States and other Western democracies didn't all just throw up their hands and say, well, the Soviets won, guess we'd better all learn to speak Russian. No, it was taken as a challenge to put our own man, an American man, on the moon by the end of the decade. These Cold War-era contests form the basis of most of Civ's victory conditions, even in instances in which the political circumstances of the game do not remotely mirror the real-life Cold War. In the Cold War, there was indeed a pressure to match and exceed the Soviet accomplishments in order to beat them. But would that have been the same if an allied nation like the UK or France or Australia or Morocco had launched the first satellite or person into space? I would certainly hope not. But Civilization seems to think so. I would hope that, had that been the case, the United States would have worked with those allied powers to move their space program further, even if it meant the first person on the moon would be British or Moroccan instead of American. But the United States rising up to meet that challenge didn't mark the end of history either. It led to space shuttles, space stations, and eventually to the privatization of space and the impending appearance of space tourism that we're starting to see flourish now. And since the decommissioning of the NASA Space Shuttle fleet, United States astronauts fly to the International Space Station on Russian rockets, and American astronauts cohabitate on the ISS with Russian cosmonauts, Chinese astronauts, and astronauts of other nations, and all perform scientific experiments together for mutual benefit and gain. History goes on. And both nations, the United States and Russia, benefit from the cooperation that goes on within the ISS. Eventually, there comes a point in Civilization VI when cooperation breaks down, and any Civ that is in a position to compete for a victory has to beeline for it, while also working towards slowing down the victory progress of any other Civs who might be close to their own victories. And if the AIs of the game are programmed to try to win instead of to simply roleplay, then they'll have to do the same as well. This might mean declaring war on a Civ who is further along a victory track than you are on yours, even if that Civ has been your BFF ally and trade partner for the entirety of recorded human history. Even if it doesn't mean outright war with a longtime ally, you will at the very least be sending spies to sabotage their critical infrastructure. You can trade the entire game to boost each other's economies, have declared friendships and alliances, share the same religious and political values, and be pledged to defend each other from invasion. But when it comes time to build that spaceship or vote for world leader or fill your museums with art and artifacts, suddenly this planet just ain't big enough for the both of us. This seems to fly in the face of the plurality presented in the game's teaser trailer. Now, for the sake of fairness, this is not to say that Civilization VI is completely devoid of more pluralist or globalist or humanist mechanics, especially in its 2 expansion packs. In general, there was an attempt to give leaders more of a personality, and some of these AI leaders are much friendlier and more cooperative than others. The Rise and Fall expansion provides scaling benefits for maintaining long-lasting trade partnerships and alliances. Betraying a longtime ally can potentially cripple the economies of both nations. These diplomatic interactions can even create passive espionage with friendly civilizations without the need to explicitly send an operative or spy to spy on them, as if they trust the player enough to volunteer their sensitive information freely. The Gathering Storm expansion adds natural disasters and a climate change model that increases the frequency and intensity of natural disasters as all civilizations, industrial and military activities contribute towards the cumulative greenhouse gases trapped in the atmosphere. It takes the existential threat of real-life climate change seriously as a gameplay mechanic and an impediment to progress, and it's something that every Civ in the game has to work together to some extent to solve. These are all good ideas. They all encourage and foster cooperation. But at the end of the day, none of them, not even all of them combined, overwhelm that selfish incentive of the game's rigid and discrete victory conditions. Trade partners and military allies cannot win the game as a single coalition, no matter how long that alliance has been going or how strong that military partnership is. Eventually, one member of the coalition triggers a win state and invalidates the contributions of the others, or that single member has to actually turn on those partners or allies to slow their victory progress and cement their own. Even the climate change mechanics do not force the civilizations into greater cooperation, as a Civ can still win the game regardless of the state of the planet's climate. If you're far enough ahead, you can simply ignore the effects of climate change and brute force your way to the victory. Even if your victorious civilization now presides over a hot, desolate, flooded, storm-riddled wasteland of a planet. Better to come in first in hell than second place in heaven, I guess. At the end of the day, one leader still reigns supreme, and all others lose. And all those trade agreements, alliances, World Congress resolutions, and emergency foreign aid are proven to all have just been means to an end. Surprisingly though, this hasn't always been the case in Civilization games. There are examples of Civilization games and other 4X games from other developers that have taken different approaches to victory. Civilization IV, for example, included an option called permanent alliances, which allowed exactly 2 allied civilizations to combine their nations into one single polity that shares science, culture, resources, and, most importantly, victory. I even thought that the ideology mechanic of Civ V's second expansion, Brave New World, could have been a great way of introducing cooperative, coalition-based victories. In that game, it could have been one of the ideologies that wins the game, rather than a specific civ. Whichever ideology dominates the globe would win, and whichever civs had fully embraced and spread that ideology could have been considered the winners, even if it was more than one civ. Beyond Earth even went one step further in this direction, by tying each of the victory conditions to one of the 3 affinity paths, but it still limited its victory to a single civ. In that game, the winner of the game is the first civ to complete any of the affinity victory conditions. At that point, all other civs lose, even if those other civs had adopted the same affinity and have the exact same goals. They still cannot cooperate to fulfill that shared goal together for some reason. This was especially disconcerting in Beyond Earth, since a running theme of that game was the idea of the, quote, great mistake, unquote, that had resulted in people fleeing the Earth to begin with. The exact nature of the great mistake is never specified in-game, and is left open to each player's imagination. But the opening cinematic heavily implies that the mistake in question was the overpopulation and pollution of the planet, a direct result of the competing economic interests of Earth's nations and corporations. But the civs of Beyond Earth don't seem to learn from that mistake. Instead of working together to build sustainable colonies, they just go to another planet and repeat the same mistakes over again. It's really kind of depressing and pessimistic and nihilistic when you think about it that way. Moving outside of Firaxis-developed games, there's also Amplitude's Humankind, which takes a different approach to victory by basing the winner of the game off of a concept called fame. Basically, it's victory points that are accumulated throughout the campaign. Yes, there is still one single winner in Humankind, but the use of a scoring system instead of discrete victory conditions means that the different players are ranked, and runners-up are also awarded and celebrated on the victory screen. Their accomplishments aren't just dismissed and rendered invalid or moot. This might provide a reason to keep playing, even if you fall behind and probably won't get first place, because, you can still compete for second or third place. Furthermore, Humankind actually has a mutual destruction loss condition, in which the globe can become contaminated by pollution or nuclear fallout or climate change to the point that it is rendered unfit for human life, and presumably, at that point, all players lose. I've personally never come close to seeing this happen, so I'm actually honestly not even sure how it works. One culture in my games always runs away and triggers the endgame long before the other cultures have had a chance to heavily industrialize to the point that they're polluting that much. I don't know, maybe that will change as I get better at Humankind and go up in difficulty levels to make the other CPU cultures more competitive, or perhaps as Amplitude applies further balance tweaks. Nevertheless, I appreciate the fact that Amplitude at least considered the idea of one player's selfish play potentially ruining the game for everybody, including that one player, and that everybody in the game would have to work together to overcome that, or else they all lose. I wouldn't mind seeing a similar approach taken with a model similar to Civilization VI Gathering Storm's climate change mechanics, such that stabilizing the global climate, whether through mutually agreed climate accords or diplomatic sanctions or military force or whatever, is a necessary prerequisite for any player to win. Heck, even in the competitive tabletop board games that I play, including the ones based on the Civilization video games, there is the possibility of a tied game. Players can even agree to a truce to work towards that tie if they want to. Maybe one player in a 3-player game is snowballing towards a victory, and the other 2 players decide to gang up to defeat that snowballing player, and then divide the winnings between themselves so that they both come out the other end as the overall winners of the game. Inversely, if 2 players are close to victory, they could agree to take the tie instead of having to attack each other and drag out the game, or risk that they weaken each other so much that the 3rd player can sneak in a victory and cause them both to lose. You can't do these things in the Civilization video games, even though you can do them in the tabletop board games. At the end of the day, it's important to note that real life is not a zero-sum game, and this is becoming even more true as technology and social progress have the potential to make energy and material resources cheaper than literal dirt, eliminating much of the need for national and individual competitiveness. And also, as the problems that we face become even more global and require the cooperation of multiple nations around the globe to solve, whether it's the warming climate, nuclear proliferation, terrorism, refugee immigration, economic inequality, or the recent disturbing revival of fascistic, anti-democratic right-wing nationalism in the United States, Europe, and other countries, no one country can solve these big problems on its own. It is not the case that in order for one civilization to stand the test of time, as Civilization puts it, all other civilizations must necessarily fall. Civilization VI's announcement trailer seemed in some ways to recognize this. It's just too bad that the actual game didn't. I hope that Civilization VII makes more than a token effort to acknowledge that. If you enjoyed this content, please support this channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video, and maybe also by checking out my Patreon page. In the meantime, enjoy one more turning into the wee hours of the morning. Thanks for watching.